Oh, that's good.
Got it?
Oh, look at that. She's on camera. Wow.
Yeah, we're gonna pin his video as soon as he comes on, and also make it full screen. How do I do that? That, right there. Okay. So when he comes on, we'll pin, right now, he's not on, so I don't know if you want to text him.
Yeah, I am.
There he is.
Okay.
My great grandson.
There's my friend Karen. She told me.
Yeah, was very nice.
Yeah, I'm gonna pin his video, so his is the only one you see, not yours.
Last year.
Hi, Malka.
Great. How are you doing? Just give me a sec. I have to text Sholem.
Oh, there he is. He's
Oh,
on.
Oh, there, I see him.
Yep. I'm gonna
Okay,
pin his
great.
video.
All right, hold on. Okay. Hi, Sholem. How are you?
Oh, there he is.
All right, so
Hi,
now he's.
Shalom.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
Hi, Cheryl.
yes, we can hear.
Okay, excellent. All right. What I'm going to do, Sholem, I have to wait exactly till it's 10. I'll give a short intro to introduce you. Here, don't forget those little doodads. And then you're on. Okay. So can you see the people? You can't see the people in the room, can you?
1 second.
Yes, he should be able
Oh,
to,
he
if I tip your monitor down, he should be able to see everybody.
Okay.
So like if I went like this, he'll see everybody,
Oh, okay, great.
right? In your corner, do you see that or you only see yourself? Oops.
No, I can see everybody.
What?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Came back. Hello.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Can you see everybody in the room?
Yes,
Oh, good, excellent. Okay, and then
Yeah, that's-
I can't from my end, but you can probably see if there are other participants on the
Well, I
computer.
pinned
Yeah.
his video, so he might only see.
Oh, you might only see the people in the room, but you saw Karen was there.
yeah, Karen, I can see.
Okay. All right, so if anybody else pops up, you couldn't see them. Where's little Dove?
I'll try, he's sleeping right now. I'll try to bring him at the end.
Oh, okay. He's the highlight of our program.
Absolutely.
You could talk about this Western Sparta. We got to see little Dove. So,
What is he gonna talk about?
all right,
The old synagogue.
Johnny, good.
all right, so he's talking to my friend.
We have a new rabbi.
So you know what? So
Did you make a hire?
Yes, yeah,
Ah,
Rabbi,
great.
Rabbi Dove Winston
I don't want to touch the.
from
Excellent.
Merrick, Long Island. I don't know if you
Alright.
know him.
No, I don't know. Great, congratulations.
Yeah,
Very nice.
Yeah. kind of
Hearing you,
bittersweet, bittersweet.
It's a new era, seriously.
Oh,
Wow.
I know, I know. Gonna take a long time to get used to.
I'm sure it will.
How's, yours is Dove too, right?
Also, yeah, exactly.
How is he?
Yeah, he's great.
Adorable. I want to
great.
see him.
Yeah, we'll bring him in. He's very squishy.
Oh,
Who's he talking to? Oh, she has her picture.
That's it.
Yeah.
Good. This is very
Okay.
nice. Are you in Rochester? Yeah.
still
Yes.
here.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, so Shalom, let me start talking to the people here in the room
Great.
to introduce
Yeah.
you. Okay. Okay, so this is my son Shalom. He's my youngest child. I have 4 children. And he grew up in Rochester, New York, went to the high school there. It's called, it's part of the Chofetz Chaim network. Then he went to Yeshiva University. He also studied first he went to Israel, studying in Keren B'Yavne for 2 years, and then he went to Rav Ilson's Yeshiva, also in Yerushalayim, for 1 year. So 3 years in Eretz Yisrael. He came back, got smicha from YU, and also got a master's in Jewish history from Revel. And then he went into the rabbinate. His first position was at the Lincoln Square Synagogue. He was the assistant rabbi there.
Ah, that's
Pretty
my,
good.
that's
Yeah.
my children's.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Then from there, he got a very unique offer to go to Shevet Israel, which he at the time wasn't familiar with. And I said to him, oh, it's the oldest congregation in America. It's Portuguese. So we had to totally new when they like the Torah, the trope. This sounds very different, but he really immersed himself in that culture of what's called the Western Sephardim. He'll explain that to you. And he was in Shevet, Israel for 6 years, and then he got an offer to go to London. Shevet, Israel is the Spanish Portuguese shul on 70 West End Avenue. Not West End,
No,
Central Park West, Central Park West. And
that's
70
where Rabbi Soloveitchik
Right,
studied.
right, now he's there now. Any case, and then he went to London in Bevis Marks, which is the oldest synagogue in London. So it's kind of ironic. They are founded each just by 2 years apart, which is really interesting. Shevet Israel, New York City was founded in 1654,
Wow.
and Bevis Marks was founded in 1656. And yeah, he'll tie the whole thing in together for you. And he's been there for 6 years, correct? 6 years, Shalom? in Bevis
Going
Marks?
on, now 7, now 7.
Oh, wow. All right. And he got married not too long ago, right? Oh, a year and a half now, is it, or more? Right? And he has this beautiful little baby boy, which hopefully we'll bring in later. And his name is Dov Daniel. Of course, the Daniel's after my grandson Donnie was killed. Okay, so on to Shalom. Go ahead.
Is the
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present today, and thank you all for coming to listen to me. It's wonderful to see everyone. I miss America. I mean, I love London too, but it's nice to see everybody and the familiar accent. After my first year in London, I was talking to one of the members of my synagogue, and she said, "Oh, it's been a year. How are you finding it?" I said, "It's been great." I said, "I actually don't even hear the British accent anymore." She goes, "Oh, that's so nice. We still hear yours." But it's been wonderful to be here, and it's been fascinating experience, and wonderful to learn a new country and a new community, and levels of interest, between the Spanish and Portuguese and British Jewry and so forth. So this is a broad topic to try and, shall we say, squeeze into, what is it, an hour session?
Definitely
right?
50 minutes.
50 minutes, yeah. So it's hard to know what to do. I'm working on a PhD now here in London on, the Spanish and Portuguese community in the middle of the 19th century. So, you can do, you're talking about a community that has spanned centuries. And what I'd like to do is to maybe just give like a little bit of an overview of, shall we say, the breadth of this community. Because obviously there's the historic story around these, what are known as these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues. There's the modern day expression of these communities, some of which are still in the same places as they were centuries ago. But obviously some of those communities from centuries ago are no longer, shall we say, active anymore. You think of some of the Caribbean communities, some are active, some aren't active anymore. So in some ways, it's like some aspects of it are lost, in a sense, to history, and some of them are still alive today. And the amazing thing about the ones that are still living, like Bevis Marks Synagogue, is because they have been in the same place for over 300 years, they're the only synagogues really in the world that have been operating without interruption for 3 centuries. I mean, you think of all the rest of the communities in Europe, you think of North Africa, Middle East, over the past century, all of those communities have been obviously disrupted, destroyed, uprooted, you name it. So ironically, some of these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues in London, in New York, are the longest operating communities, synagogues in the world. So when you go into one of them and you start hearing the melodies, and you see the customs, and you kind of start immersing yourself in it, you really feel like you've been transported back in time, because they have a quality to them that feels very 18th century. So it's a really remarkable experience, whether you are Spanish and Portuguese, Ashkenazi, a Middle Eastern Sephardi, whatever it is. They're real treasures of the Jewish people because they're the few places in the world that you can go today and really have a taste of what Jewish life was like 300 years ago. And so they're very special. And as I said, some of them are still around, having been preserved. And for example, in my community, we still have members who are the descendants of the people who built, the synagogue in 1701. Some of them have anglicized their surnames. So we have one family, the Martin family, but their name is really Nunez Martinez. We have families by the names of Mendoza, Da Costa, Herrera, Nunez Vaz. I could keep going. So these communities are not just, shall we say, completely history or, stories of assimilation and, disappearance. They are still alive and active today. In fact, in London, there are several Spanish and Portuguese synagogues. We have our own Bet Din, our own Kashrut Authority, our own, welfare society, and so forth. So these communities are really still alive, because of in the places where they exist, they have been so outnumbered by the influx of Ashkenazi Jews in the past century. Think of, the influx to America in the late 1800s of Eastern European Jews, and same thing into London. They've almost been eclipsed, by those other communities that almost they become, to a large extent, invisible, to most people, unless you actually know them, and then you realize that they're an entire world that are still there. So that's really just a short way of saying these are very special places. And if you've been to any of them before, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't been and you find yourself in a place where a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue exists, I would definitely encourage you to take a poke around. They're really really special. So what I'd like to do is really just talk about what do I even mean by a Spanish Portuguese synagogue, because they are not in Spain and they are not in Portugal, and yet they are Spanish and Portuguese. And of course, as you obviously know from, probably most Jewish people know, but certainly from this class, is of course the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492, and then they were expelled from Portugal in 1497. But as you've also learned, not everybody left. Some of them felt compelled to adopt Christianity so that they could save their lives. And in fact, we even know that some of the people who left in 1492 to say, no, I'm not going to stay, ended up coming back and converting. It was not a simple process to leave. Where are you going to go? What country is willing to accept you? Will there be food for you to eat? It was not a simple proposition. And so not surprisingly, some people, to save their lives, had to make a difficult decision. But what you find is that over time, some of them did leave, but there have been so many of them that had, in addition to so many that did leave, there were so many of them that had been forced to remain behind, particularly in Portugal, that they actually formed their own communities while still in places like Lisbon and other towns in Portugal. And while they were ostensibly living as Catholics, they were still maintaining, shall we say, Jewish connections, because they were only marrying amongst each other, right? They were doing business with one another. Maybe they were even praying with one another, right? And so they were somehow still forming communities, ostensibly Catholic communities, but still separate communities. And in fact, there were laws in Portugal that and in Spain that distinguish between old Christians and new Christians. So even legally, they were kind of kept apart from one another. And so this really allowed them to maintain their sense of identity. Now, of course, with the Inquisitions that were put in place in Portugal and in Spain, it was dangerous, right? Because they were looking to say, well, you're supposed to be a Catholic, but are you still keeping kosher? Are you still observing Shabbat? Are you still fasting on Yom Kippur? And it was dangerous if they were caught doing any of these things. They could have their property seized. They could potentially even be put to death. So it was not a simple situation. You know, some of them perhaps just settled into this new life, but some of them continue to kind of maintain these, shall we say, double identities. And so at times of increased Inquisition activity, you would often find that communities of these Portuguese and Spanish Jews would escape or would relocate to places where they could live safely. Okay, and so it was a very complicated experience for them. But one thing you have to appreciate, we'll kind of see this, we're going to look at some maps in a moment, is that the Inquisition operated in Spain and Portugal into the 1800s. Okay, this was not something that happened in 1492 and that was it, right? 1492 is the expulsion, but the Inquisition that was interested in those who didn't leave and what they were doing behind closed doors lasted for centuries, which gives you a little bit of a sense that if the Inquisition was active for centuries, it's because there was actually something for them to look at for centuries. So many of these, shall I say, these converted families, these conversos, as historians refer to them, right? People used to call them Marranos. We don't tend to do that anymore. These conversos, that they were, to some extent, some of them were still maintaining Jewish practices clandestinely, right? The stories you hear, people lighting candles in their basements, you know, on Friday afternoon, those kinds of things. And so it really was preserved. And so you find people leaving, even in the 1700s, moving to places like London at the age of 50 years old, having Brit Milah, being circumcised, right? If they've been married, having now a chuppah, right? So they're going to have a halachic marriage and really kind of be living full Jewish lives at that stage. So you're talking about 200, 250 years of living as Catholics. They still knew that they were Jews. They still had married amongst themselves, and they still had a sense of identity. It's remarkable. It's absolutely remarkable that you think, you know, 8 generations have passed, no access to proper Jewish education, no access, you know, to synagogues, you know, that they still were able to kind of preserve some semblance of a Jewish identity. The reason all of that is important is it gives you a sense of, shall we say, the complicated nature of the people who found these communities, but I would also say a sense of like this commitment, right? This like somehow like this deep rooted sense of identity that was almost like a latent potential for 200 years, that as soon as they get out, it kind of like bursts open and they are able to build Jewish communities from scratch, because they will end up settling in places that do not have any Jewish communities, because Jews have been expelled systematically from Western Europe from medieval times. And so these Spanish and Portuguese Jews will be the first Jews to end up settling in Western Europe and ultimately in the Americas. And so you have a sense of who they were, that they were able to go places without any Jewish life, and they were able to build synagogues and schools and have, you know, shechita, have kosher, you know, do the things that you need to do to have a Jewish life. And to the extent that the communities they built, many of them are still there today. So there are remarkable people that, you know, kind of imagine like the pressure they were under over their centuries in Portugal, that they really kind of, it bred in them a real kind of passion ultimately that they were able to put in practice. And again, they're a very complicated story. So what I'd like to simply do is to just give maybe an overview of their, shall we say, areas of activity in terms of where they were settling in Western Europe, where they were settling in the Americas. And we'll just kind of see where that, I think, takes us. certainly if people, at a certain point, I'll pause. And if people have questions, I'll be happy to take. So before we kind of jump in on the maps, does anybody have any kind of like questions? Otherwise, I'll just kind of jump in and we'll start seeing, and then we'll pause a little bit later for more questions.
One question.
Yeah.
I have a question. Will you be speaking about Touro Synagogue? I'm the Rabbi Emeritus. So Touro has a long history, and actually Touro is the oldest synagogue in America or North America. So please give a little talk about them, if you don't mind.
Touro is going to be in there. What remind me what your name is, Rabbi?
Well, I'm sorry,
No.
Remind me your name, Rabbi.
I didn't hear him.
Your name.
Oh, Eskowitz, Mordechai Eskowitz.
I've actually was there when you were still a rabbi. I came once for a visit, and I think we did mincha together or something. So
Oh, good. I'm glad you remembered me.
good. Yeah, good. Very nice to see you. Very nice to see you. Yes, lady. Yeah.
All synagogues have the same routine. I was in Holland and they have like 12 chandeliers for the 12 tribes, so on. Does it have also in England the same thing? And the floor is not the floor, it's like a sanded floor or something. Like sand.
Yeah, so it's a good question. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about some of those things. There is a lot of symbolism in the way they built their synagogues. And remind me later, let's get back to that, because there are similarities. And it's one of the things I want to focus on. There is a similarity between the different Spanish and Portuguese. And you kind of can walk into one of them and know this is a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, not necessarily because of sand floors, but there are things like what you're referencing that we'll talk about. Yeah. Great. And any other questions?
Yes, Shalom, when
Yes.
you talk about the Jews of Portugal, right, there was an edict of expulsion, but really most of them were forcibly converted and had
That's
to
right.
stay.
Yeah, right. They didn't have the choice. Exactly. Yeah. Good. Okay, great. So let me, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this will work, and we'll take a look at this. Brilliant. Okay, can everybody see the screen up over here? Okay, so here we just kind of see a map of the world. Okay, and we're going to take a look at some of these places a bit more in detail. I'm just trying to set up my screen so I can see better. Okay, great. So let's take a look. I'm actually going to start in America, in the location of the first synagogue in America. And by America, I don't mean the United States of America. It's before there was the United States of America, in the Americas. So not even in North America. So we're going to take a look. This area, Brazil, is actually the first place that there was a synagogue in the Americas. And it dates to 1630 in a town called Recife. Okay, Recife has a synagogue. This is a rebuilt, shall we say, replica of that original synagogue in Recife. Recife, just so people can see, is this little map over here is the edge of Brazil, right? So Brazil kind of pops out into the Atlantic. So that's where Recife is. Recife is on the very tip of Brazil. And there they had a synagogue, which they named Sur Yisrael, which is a bit of a pun because Recife in Portuguese means the rock. And so, right, because it was in rocky outcropping. And so they named their synagogue the Rock of Israel, right? That's the rock of Brazil, but this is the rock of Israel, meaning, which is a euphemism, right, in the Bible for God, right? And so they had a bit of a play on word with the name. So that's where the first community was in the Americas. And it was a large community, it had over 1,000 Jews. It had actually multiple synagogues, some well-known rabbis, and it lasted until 1654, okay? Which will be important for a bit what we'll talk about. In 1654, it is captured by the Portuguese, who the Dutch had captured it from 24 years earlier. Obviously, being captured by the Portuguese is not good for the Jews because they're going to bring the Inquisition. So most of them have to leave. They sign an agreement with the Dutch that if the Dutch surrender, they will give the Jews 3 months to leave without persecuting them by the Inquisition. Most of them will go back to Europe, to Amsterdam. 23 of them go to New Amsterdam, which of course will become New York, and some of them will go to other places in the Caribbean. So it's a short-lived community, but it was a large community, and it kind of, its end kind of scattered people to different places, to North America, to the Caribbean, and back to places in Europe. Okay. But obviously the story of all of this really begins in Western Europe, right? That's where the story really begins. The story of the Americas will come a bit later, and we'll go back to the Americas in a little bit later in the presentation. But let's take a look, because the different communities are founded at different times, and they actually can be helpful in kind of plotting the migration of these Spanish and Portuguese Jews to different places. And by the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, again, I'm kind of referring not to the Jews who leave in 1492, right, who go to North Africa, who go to the Ottoman Empire, right? But when we use the term the S&P, or the Spanish and Portuguese, or the Western Sephardim, we tend to be talking about these Jews that were converted and then at some point left and reverted to Judaism and set up communities in Western Europe and in the Americas, okay? So Spanish and Portuguese has kind of a specific connotation, and when you use that term, which, while obviously a Jew in the Ottoman Empire might say, well, I'm Spanish too, that's not what we mean when we say the Spanish and Portuguese, right? In some of the communities, they refer to themselves simply as the Portuguese, but we'll just, for ease sake, refer to it as the SNP, which is the Spanish and Portuguese. So obviously, the most famous of all of these communities is located in Amsterdam, and that community begins in the early 1600s. Now, the reason that it starts there is that the Netherlands had actually been under the control of the Spanish, but the Dutch had fought for their independence from the Spanish. And of course, there are religious conflict because the Dutch become Protestant, right? And so throwing off the Spanish gives them freedom of worship, that they are able to now live, right, their faith. And so they're living as Protestants. And so what ends up happening is that, shall we say, these conversos that are in Amsterdam are able to say, well, you know, we're not going to be Catholic anymore either. We're not becoming Protestants, we're becoming Jews. And the Protestants, they don't really bother them because they also threw off being Catholic, right? They also just fought for religious freedom. And so there is this, shall we say, toleration of Jewish people, because despite the fact that they had been Christians, and there's no persecution as a result of that. And so the community begins to grow and becomes actually incredibly wealthy and plays an important role in what becomes known as the Dutch Golden Age, which is the 17th century. You know, you think of Rembrandt. Rembrandt lived just down the street from the Portuguese synagogue, which is known as the Asnocha, which is built in 1675. You can see the pictures there on your screen. And it becomes a very wealthy trading merchant community. Many of these Portuguese Jews were merchants. They had trading connections in the Mediterranean, in the New World, and in Western Europe. And as a result, they play a really important role in the emerging world of the 16 and 1700s, which of course is all about colonial trade and different products and so forth. They're not actively involved in the slave trade. It's worthwhile mentioning. It was deemed too lucrative of a trade to permit the Jews to get involved with, because the experience was that typically when these Portuguese Jews got involved in a particular industry, or shall we say commodity, they basically monopolized it. Because they had connections in all these places, they kind of were able to kind of corner markets. So they were not permitted to engage in what was considered a very lucrative slave trade. So Jews were not, despite what some anti-Semites say, Jews were not, while some Jews did own slaves, they were definitely not the drivers of the slave trade or of slave holding. Though there's entire books written on that subject. But in any case, Amsterdam becomes a very important Portuguese or Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community. They build beautiful synagogue, which for any of you that have been there, it's massive. I mean, it seats thousands, like 3,000 people. It's cavernous. It actually doesn't have electricity still. It's cold in the winter, so they tend to use a smaller synagogue in the winter that they can heat more easily. But an incredible relic. I mean, it's still standing there. It's still used. It's a very special place. What's important to know, though, is that Amsterdam is not the beginning, right? Amsterdam, what basically happens, all these communities, as I said, they're coming from nowhere. So when they create their communities, they have to look to other communities for the model for what a Jewish community looks like, what the rules and regulations of a Jewish community should be. And so governance questions, literally how do you structure the governance of your community? And so they have to look to earlier communities to do so. What really is what one might call the mother kind of community of the Spanish and Portuguese is in Venice. So for those of you that have been to the ghetto, you know the beautiful, beautiful synagogues that are there, and they're known by different names, right? There's the Levantine synagogue, and there's the Spanish synagogue. The Spanish synagogue is the Portuguese synagogue. The Levantine synagogue are the Jews who were coming from the Ottoman Empire, right? So Venice is a very important trading center in the 16th century, right? That's the heyday of Venice, is the 16th century. And so you have Jews from the Ottoman Empire, right, who originally from Spain, who then settle in Venice. And then you'll also have some of these Portuguese conversos that will settle in Venice too. And they create the Spanish synagogue, which is there. That's what you have pictured over here. Beautiful, magnificent. I mean, you really feel like you're entering a different world when you visit those different synagogues. I mean, the red, I mean, it feels so, it feels kind of very Catholic. I mean, obviously that Italy was a Catholic country, but it wasn't they didn't have an Inquisition. And again, that's a whole other story. And again, that's kind of like one of the early communities that will form the model for these later Portuguese communities that will be established in places where there aren't any other communities at all, right? So they're kind of finding their place among other Jewish communities. In Venice, you have, as I said, a Levantine community, an Ottoman Jewish community. You have an Italian Jewish community, right? So the Jews who are from the previous Italian Jews who go back even to the Second Temple, to Beit Sheni, and then you have Ashkenazi Jews there too. So the ghetto is full of lots of different Jewish communities that are there, but this will kind of act as the model for then the later Portuguese communities that will be established further west from Venice. And we'll just take a look again. I'll just kind of go through this, right? 1492 expulsion. As I mentioned, many of those people will go to Portugal, and then from Portugal, they will end up going out. One of the key places that they go to, that the Portuguese Jews go to, is Livorno, which I think some people know it as Leghorn, okay? Livorno is on the western coast of Italy, right? So it's on facing Western Europe, as opposed to Venice, which is facing the Ottoman Empire, right? So this is facing west. And in Livorno, you will kind of have what we might think of as the first proper Portuguese, Spanish and Portuguese, independent community. Livorno is a fascinating story. It's part of the Medici rule, who set up Livorno as shall we say, a tax-free trading city. on the port, right? Of course, to generate funds. Obviously, the main city is Florence, but they set up this kind of tax-free city to encourage trade and merchants and so forth, right? And so these Portuguese Jews who are Portuguese merchants, so they have a lot of experience as part of the Portuguese trading network empire, are very attractive to them. They're permitted to settle there, and they build a magnificent synagogue, which predates the Portuguese synagogue in Amsterdam, and really becomes the model, starts to create kind of the model of what these Portuguese synagogues look like. If you just take a quick look at the picture on the left, it doesn't have the benches in it, but you can see how it has what in S&P they refer to as the teba, or the bima, right, which is set towards the back, and the hechal, or the ark, is towards the front. That is like a classic Spanish and Portuguese style for setting up the synagogue. As opposed to in Ashkenazi shuls, you tend to have the bima towards the front of the shul, even though nowadays you have Ashkenazi shuls that also put it a bit towards the middle for acoustic reasons. That's a bit more of a modern innovation within Ashkenazi communities. The Spanish and Portuguese, though, were always doing that, setting the tibah towards the back, and of course this large gallery for where the women would have been sitting, right? So one of the things that's unique is they are having space in the shul for women to sit, right? Many of the medieval Ashkenazi shuls do not have that. Maybe it's a separate room with some little slats that they can peer through. It's really separate. But these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues are building sections where women can sit in the synagogue. They tend to be in galleries, right? That's the way that it's structured. On the right, you can see a better image of what it looked like. Unfortunately, the shul is no longer there. It was accidentally bombed by the Americans in the Second World War. Livorno was an important port city and had been taken over by the Germans. And basically, the Americans bombed the city to smithereens to bring the Nazis to heel, to stop their ability to move arms and things like that. So if you go to Livorno today, which I've done, they've built a new shul there, which is very modern looking. And as you walk around Livorno, it's not, I don't think it's a very attractive city. It basically looks like a 1960s city. But here and there, you see some buildings that remain from beforehand, and you get a glimpse of like what the whole city would have looked like with just these beautiful, kind of neoclassical buildings, which of course this synagogue kind of fits into that style. That was a very large, important community in the 1600s, the 1700s, even into the 1800s. Before that community, in the 1800s, begins to decline for various reasons. What I'll say is with most of these communities we're going to talk about, their rise and fall is tightly connected to economics. Right? Most of these communities begin in places that have important economic value when they are founded. And as they economically decline, not surprisingly, the communities decline as well. Right? So that's certainly the case in a place like Livorno. The community in Amsterdam will model themselves on the community in Livorno and on Venice, and build their beautiful synagogue with echoing that beautiful grand synagogue in Italy. And then from there, you have the movement in the middle of the 1600s to say, well, now London is becoming an important port city. They are beginning to expand into the Americas too, right? This is the very beginning of the British Empire, right? They're beginning to have colonies, right? The first colony in North America is the 1620s, right? So just the beginning of that. And so there's an interest in, shall we say, establishing a community there too. One of the Portuguese rabbis from Amsterdam goes to London to try to negotiate with Oliver Cromwell, the Lord Protector. It's during the interregnum between the monarchs, right? So at this point, England is a republic. And he ultimately, it doesn't succeed immediately, but ultimately what happens is that Jews are permitted to settle in England. There's never any kind of formal edict permitting Jews to settle there, but basically they just kind of look the other way. They're not really bothered by it. Jews had been expelled from England in 1290. So there was a debate in the 1650s about whether the Edict of Expulsion of 1290 was still in effect. And if it was still in effect, it would require them to rescind this Edict of 1290. So there was a whole debate about, was the Edict of 1290 still in effect? And what they determined was that the
Unless
edict,
somebody wants to get Andrea.
sorry? Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. There was a pause.
Okay, what they determined is that the edict was still in effect, but that it only applied to those who were living in England in 1290. And so, so in a very British way, they were able to kind of say, well, the edict is still in effect, but it basically doesn't apply to anybody anymore. And so they never kind of developed a specific Jewish policy with regulations for Jews. They basically just didn't care. The British were much more worried about Catholics, all these Catholic plots, these papist plots. Jews were not their concern. And so Jews began to settle in London in the 1650s openly and start to grow their community. At first, they rent space in a house that they convert into a synagogue. But by 1701, the community has grown large enough that they are able to build a purpose-built synagogue, which becomes known as Bevis Marks Synagogue, because the name of the street that the synagogue is located on is called Bevis Marks. It's not the actual name of the community. The actual name of the community is Shar HaShamayim, which means gate of heaven. But it's known popularly as Bevis Marks Synagogue, right? So you type in Bevis Marks in the synagogue, you'll find us probably more easily than if you type in Shar HaShamayim. So this synagogue was built in 1701, is still there. I'm actually right next to it. My house is attached to the synagogue, and it's absolutely magnificent. It's modeled after the synagogue in Amsterdam, right? This is built just 25 years after the synagogue in Amsterdam is built. But instead of seating 3,000 people, it seats 500, right? So it's considered a smaller community, though the community will grow quite substantially in the years after the synagogue is built. But the synagogue really is the heart of the Spanish and Portuguese community in London for the next 150 years, till the middle of the 1800s, when the community starts setting up other synagogues in other parts of the city. Today, there's 3 Spanish and Portuguese synagogues, but this one, where I'm the rabbi, is still open, is still an active synagogue. It's located now, as it was then, right, in the very middle center of London, in what's known as the City of London. And obviously we're surrounded by often business buildings, and then a few streets over are residential properties. But where the synagogue itself is located is kind of in the commercial district. And it's again, the layout of the synagogue is very typical of these Spanish and Portuguese synagogues. The bima towards the back, obviously the ark in the front, the gallery where the ladies sit, and so forth, right? This very classic Spanish and Portuguese style. Now what happens, and I'll just take a few more minutes and then we'll kind of open it up for questions, is all of these places where Jews are settling are their own empires, right? You have the Italians, they have their kind of Mediterranean influence. You have the Dutch, who will create their own colonies in the New World. And then, of course, you have the British, who will have their own colonies in the New World. I mean, until those colonists rebel, right? But until then, right, they have their colonies in the New World. And each of these synagogues basically become their own parent synagogues for the synagogues that will be established in the New World by their empires, right? So Amsterdam will play a really important role for the Dutch synagogues in the New World, and Bevis Marks will play a really important role in the British synagogues in the New World. Okay, so let's skip forward, right? So that's Bevis Marks. My house is that building to the left, that townhouse over there. That's where I live. I'm in the bottom floor that you can see there. And then we'll skip to the New World. So as the rabbi mentioned, you have the Turo Synagogue. That's built in 1763. That's the oldest remaining synagogue in North America. There are older ones in the Caribbean. There were synagogues that were older than this in America, but this is the oldest one that remains. Beautiful synagogue. And if you look at it, just the main part of the building, it looks like Bevis Marks. It's not brick. It looks like a colonial building, but it has the same structure of Bevis Marks, right? So if you just go back for a second, you look at Bevis Marks, it has the 3 windows on the top, 1 on each side of the door, and it's a rectangular shape. So basically, that's built in London style. You go to Newport, and it's built in colonial American style, but it's essentially the same synagogue, just smaller than Bevis Marks, right? So they're just modeling it after their parent synagogue in London, right? You have to imagine when this is built, there's no United States of America. It's a British colony, and in fact, the Jews in Newport, a lot of them left because they tended to be loyalists. The Jews in New York, they tended to be a bit. Any case, it's a whole story. Not all of them. It was a mixed bag. Any case, skipping forward, right? Let's take a look at New York. So New York is established. They built their first synagogue in 1730. This is an image of Lower Manhattan. From when it was still Dutch. You can see they were actually building canals into Lower Manhattan. They were trying to really make it a new Amsterdam, which is that where you see the canal, that's now Broad Street. And the reason it's so broad is when the British came, they filled in the canal because they didn't like it. But as a result, it's a very broad street because the buildings were already built. So they didn't shrink the street, they just filled it in. So that's where Broad Street is. The top of it is where Wall Street is. You can actually see the wall. It's in this image. That's where Wall Street was. And at the top over there, that's where, today, what we know as Wall Street, that's where the exchange is located. So in any case, this is the synagogue in 1730, the Mill Street Synagogue. And as you can see, it also looks like Bevis Marks. The 3 windows, the door, probably even smaller. The community in New York was very, very small. It was a few hundred Jews. It will remain one of the smaller colonial era communities until you get to, the 1800s, when it will really start to grow. But again, you can see the influence of Bevis Marks. And then I'll show you one other one. This other one is in Jamaica, in Spanish Town. That synagogue, which is depicted here, is no longer there. It was destroyed in a hurricane, I think, or an earthquake. It was built in 1704, so just 3 years after Bevis Marks. And again, you take away the portico entrance, it just looks like Bevis Marks, right? So you can kind of see the influence and kind of the way these communities structured. They kind of had their mother synagogues in Amsterdam or in London, and they kind of modeled their communities and their synagogues after them, right? Just smaller and smaller depending on the size of their communities. And particularly during this kind of the 1700s, 1700s, even into the 1800s, these networks between these communities was very strong, right? Historians today refer to this as Atlantic history. So not necessarily European history, not American history, not Caribbean history, but Atlantic, because you really have to kind of think about all these communities together to understand how they actually functioned, because of course they were colonies. And so they can't be looked at on their own. It's all about the colonial relationships that determine them. As I mentioned, the story of economics plays a role. Obviously, the Caribbean stops being an important economic hub. And so those communities decline. The American South obviously declines. And so a lot of those communities cease to operate as original Spanish, they become Reform congregations. But in places like New York and London, that 300 years later are still hopping, major economic centers, those Spanish and Portuguese communities are still active and vibrant communities. In Amsterdam, there's still active community. In France, in Paris, there's an active community. And even today, there's a synagogue in Yerushalayim, which is a Spanish and Portuguese. So the communities have, some of them have survived. In some places, while the communities haven't survived, the buildings still survive. And it's what's important to appreciate about them, and I'll kind of leave you with this before any final questions, is these communities laid the basis for Jewish life in the West, right? When you end up having these mass migrations of Ashkenazi Jews, they're able to do that because these Spanish and Portuguese Jews had already gone there, had already established Jewish life, had pushed the envelope for the rights for Jews to live in these places, and they create the possibility for Jews to settle there. And the same thing is true for Israel, right? The first kind of active push of modernizing Jewish life in Israel comes out of Spanish and Portuguese Jews in places like London, like Moses Montefiore, who builds settlements in Western Jerusalem, who builds the windmill. So these Spanish and Portuguese Jews really laid the groundwork for what today would become the most important Jewish communities in the world, right? That of America and that of Israel. So while they kind of end up being almost, like, as I said, hidden from view because so many other Jews end up settling in these places, their contribution shouldn't be forgotten, but their communities themselves are still there for anybody that wants to go and enjoy them and be part of them. And I definitely would encourage you, if you are in a place where one of them exists, go for a tour. If you can go and actually be there on a Shabbat and hear the beautiful melodies, it's amazing. You've never heard anything like it. It's a really special, very special experience. Yeah, the real treasures of the Jewish world. And obviously, if any of you end up coming to London, please come and you'll be my guest. I'll be very happy to show you around. So I'm going to stop my share, and I'll hand over to my mother if you want to monitor if anybody has questions and so forth, or if you have anything you want me to add.
All right.
I'd like to point out that Touro Synagogue had its Jewish cemetery before Bevis Marks was built, okay, in the late 1600s, because Touro Synagogue got started 4 years after New York City did, 4 years after, and for a long time. And so as a result, we still have the Jewish cemetery from the late 1600s is still there, and it's protected. And it just shows you how long there was the 4 year separation led to a long interaction until let's say 1820, when Newport dissipated. The entire commerce went downhill. And so the Jewish community at that point turned over its keys to the Spanish Portuguese. And then we don't know what happened in between the turning that time and when they returned. There's a lot of mystery, and it depends on who you ask what really happened. Was this a loan, or was this a chazaka? Was it, so it depends on who you ask, but that's what I like to add. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, what's the halacha for Jews who were forced to convert to Catholicism, and then they wanted to live like Jews again? What this procedure, what it have to do?
Yeah, it's interesting. So it seems that there was no requirement for them to, because they had always married amongst themselves, there was an awareness that they were still, shall we say, halachically Jews, even if they had lived as Catholics. And so when they, shall we say, wanted to live as Jews again, they didn't have to do anything. I mean, if they were men, they had to be circumcised. And we know from records, you had 80-year-old men being circumcised, when they left Portugal. I mean, quite significant. They had to have chuppah and so forth, to have a Jewish marriage, but they didn't have to convert. They didn't have to, go to the mikvah, or something like that, because they already were Jews. Yeah.
If they were already married and had children, did they have to make an chuppah again?
Yes, he just said.
Yes,
They
yes,
had a Jew.
yeah. Sorry, I can't hear.
The Ladino and the Sfaradim are the mixed, the Ladino, the original, they call themselves Ladino.
No, that's Ottoman
And they-
Empire.
Yeah, so the Jews in the Ottoman Empire spoke what we call today Ladino, which is kind of a mixture between medieval Spanish and and Greek and Hebrew and so forth. The Jews, the Spanish and Portuguese Jews, spoke Portuguese. They spoke Portuguese. They didn't speak Ladino.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you want to mention the other major Spanish Portuguese communities in America and the Caribbean?
Sure. So yeah, so the places where you find them. So the original 5 in America were Newport, New York. New York has a very active community, though their synagogue is from the late 1800s. Philadelphia still has an active community. You also have in Charleston and Savannah, who have synagogue. The communities are reformed now. The synagogues, though, date from the 1800s. You have a Spanish and Portuguese community in Montreal. Again, it was a British colony, and that still is an active community. And then in the Caribbean, you had in several places. You had in Jamaica, in Curacao, in Barbados, in St. Thomas. They all still have synagogue buildings that you can visit. There was a synagogue in St. Eustatius, which is now a ruin, that can be visited. And there's also were synagogues in South America, not just in Brazil, where I'd mentioned earlier, but also in the country of Suriname, which had been a Dutch colony too. And one of the Portuguese synagogues that had been in Suriname, you can visit today in Israel, in the Israel Museum. They moved the synagogue to the Israel Museum, and you can go there and walk on the sand floors. It's really special. So next time you go to Israel Museum, you can visit a Portuguese synagogue in the museum. In Yerushalayim, yes. Yeah.
How does an Ashkenazi person who grew up as a child as Ashkenazi and went to Ashkenazi schools and so forth, how do they fit into a Spanish and Portuguese synagogue as a rabbi?
They don't. It's a
Yeah, I mean, ironically, I now know often more about the community and its customs than some of the people in the community. So, I mean, basically, the community, I think, is just appreciates that they have a rabbi who's really passionate about preserving their traditions. That's something really important to these communities, is preserving their minhagim, not to lose what makes their communities distinct and special. And I've devoted myself to helping them do that. And so that's something that they appreciate, and I've enjoyed it, and I think they've enjoyed it. It's been definitely, like you said, a different experience for me, having grown up in Ashkenazi community. But in a lot of ways, these Spanish and Portuguese Jews, you could almost call them the first modern Orthodox Jews. They were modern people. They were trading. They were dressing like the people around them, but they were maintaining Judaism and Shabbat and Kashrut and so forth. So before it ever happens, among, Ashkenazi Jews and German Jews, the Spanish Portuguese Jews were doing it for centuries beforehand. So there's a certain resonance I find in it, because they really are kind of the first modern Orthodox Jews. So for me, that was like a personal resonance that I was able to kind of latch on to, I would say.
What do you do with Kitniot and Pesach?
You said that the first holiday opened up in America in the 1600s. What was the holiday that opened up?
Holiday?
Jewish holidays. That's what I understand. That the first holiday.
No, the first synagogues were in the 1600s.
Yeah. What was
Yeah.
the first holiday? Was Rosh Hashanah? Was it-
There's a story that they did Rosh Hashanah in 1654 in New York. Yeah.
What do you do with Kitniot?
That's a private conversation. I eat kitniot now. I eat kitniot. Yeah.
You eat kitniot.
Yes,
I do.
but he's,
I do.
that's what I'm saying, he's in
Oh, I
Israel
see,
too.
because he's
I'm asking
Ashkenazi.
him
That's a good
particularly.
question.
I do. I eat kitniot. I'm comfortable saying it.
I accept it.
Even
He's
in
posking
Israel,
for himself.
I didn't know, because I was teaching, and I was, the first child that came to me about kitniot, approached it, I had to ask the principal if I can open up the door to kitniot, because we were all Ashkenazi school,
Okay,
and that's what I'm asking.
Okay. All right, Shalom, that was really fabulous. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
There's another class that comes in here now. The rabbi gives a parsha shir. So I thank you. I know, where's little Dove? He's still sleeping?
Oh.
Sorry.
I was waiting the whole lecture.
Yeah.
I have to make private other connections, or I'll show you my phone. I have pictures of him. So thank you, Shalom.
Thank
So
you all
nice
so
to
much.
see
It's been
you.
wonderful. Wonderful to study with all of you.
And we all have American accents.
And Rochester.
That's right. Okay, I'll hope to see you all next time in
Thank
Florida.
you, Shalom.
Bye-bye.
It was great. It was
Thank you, Karen. Good
great.
to see you. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Have a lot
Bye,
of
Dom.
nachas, Malka.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay.
Brilliant.
Oh, good. And there's some of my friends from Boca are on also. Great.
Hi, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Good. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thank
Very
you.
much.
Malka, is there a class next week
Fabulous.
or no?
No, it's Purim. No.
Right, right.
I'll give a Navi class. I'll have a Navi class on
Yeah,
Monday.
I'm gonna be
Yeah,
in
but-
Teaneck, so I'm not sure, but I'm gonna
Oh.
try to do it from Teaneck, so. For the numbers.
Okay.
Okay,
Very good. All right. Bye, everybody.
bye-bye.
I know she can see you. I don't know how to get, I'll let you.
What happens? What's this supposed to be about early?
Oh, very good.
Early Acronym, I should say.
Well, I will fill in then with the different Rabbanim. But his lecture was just to give you a background to what was going on.
Is there gonna be something on that?
No, I teach that. I teach that.
Right, right.
He was just giving a one-time lecture about where those Western Sephardim settled throughout the world. And I fill in, I do about the
The Curacao shul became.
Thank you.
No problem.
Many years ago.
I think it might be a small.
President of